The morning broke not with light, but with a slow dilution of the dark, leaving the world in a state of weary gray. A fine, dry snow had fallen in the night, a sugar dusting over the dead grass and hard, unforgiving earth of the Granger homestead. It did little to soften the landscape, serving only to highlight its skeletal remains, the splintered fence posts, the dark, fallow fields, the gaunt ribs of a wagon abandoned to the elements. Eli Granger moved through the cold with a practiced, rigid economy of motion. His breath plumed in front of his face, the only soft thing in a world of sharp edges, the ache in his shoulder, a constant companion from a thrown horse years ago, bit deeper in the chill. He scattered feed for the half-dozen chickens, their clucking a dull, lifeless sound. He broke the ice in the water trough with the heel of his boot, the crack of it sharp and violent in the stillness. Each chore was a stone he laid, one after another, building a wall against the sounds that drifted from the house. They were not the sounds a house should make, not the easy laughter of children or the hum of a woman's song. It was the sharp, fretful cry of the youngest, Martha, a sound that started and stopped as if she'd forgotten how to draw a full breath. And it was the silence from the other two, a silence somehow louder and more damning than any cry. His brother's children, his burden. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the world had ended. He saw it every time he closed his eyes. A reel of images burned into the back of his mind. The sky had been a bruised purple that afternoon, the air thick with the promise of a storm. He had told Samuel not to push the herd home, to wait it out, to let the storm pass. But Samuel, ever optimistic, ever certain of his own strength, had just grinned his wide, easy grin. "We'll beat it, Eli. Mary's got a stew on, and the little ones will be waiting." Eli had stayed behind to mend a fence line, a task he could have left for another day. He told himself it was necessary, but the truth, the bitter, galling truth, was that he had wanted the solitude. The boisterous, happy chaos of his brother's family was a language he had never learned to speak. He preferred the company of wind and wood and wire. The storm had broken with a biblical fury. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to a slick, sucking mud. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting open. He had worked through it, head down, the familiar rhythm of the labor a comfort. It was only when the wind carried a different sound, a low, guttural rumble that was not thunder, that a cold knot of dread tightened in his gut. It was the sound of terror, of 1,000 pounds of panicked beef moving as one unstoppable force, a stampede. He had ridden out into the maelstrom, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He found them less than a mile from home. The cattle were scattered, their eyes wild. The wagon was overturned, one wheel still spinning lazily in the mud. Samuel was pinned beneath it, his body twisted at an angle that defied nature. His eyes were open, staring at the cruel sky. The easy grin wiped away forever. Mary was a dozen yards away, a small, broken thing in the mud, her Sunday dress torn and stained. She had been thrown clear. Eli found himself praying it had been quick, a prayer that felt hollow and useless. The children had been at the house with a neighbor. The silence when he walked in, his face a mask of mud and grief, was absolute. 3 pairs of eyes, Sarah, the eldest at 10, Thomas, the solemn 8-year-old, and little Martha, barely 5, fixed on him. They knew. Children always knew. In that moment, his life, the solitary, manageable life he had so carefully constructed, had been burned to the ground. He was all they had left, and he, a man who had never wanted a family, a man who felt ill at ease with the simplest of affections, was left with the shattered pieces of his brothers. Now, their grief was a palpable presence in the small, decaying house. Sarah had taken on a brittle, womanly air, trying to sweep and tidy, but her movements were jerky, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed. She would drop a plate and not cry, but stand trembling, her small face a study in utter desolation. Thomas had not spoken a full sentence since the funeral. He would sit by the cold hearth for hours, whittling a piece of wood down to nothing, his expression blank and distant. He was gone, retreated to a place where no one, least of all Eli, could reach him. And Martha, she just cried, a constant, whimpering sob that followed Eli from room to room, a constant accusation. He was clumsy with them, a bull in a china shop of sorrow. His attempts at comfort came out as gruff commands. Eat your food. Stop that crying. Go to your beds. He knew they were the wrong words, but they were the only ones he had. He cooked for them, a tasteless, lumpy stew of salted pork and potatoes, day after day. He tried to mend their clothes, his large, calloused fingers fumbling with a needle and thread, producing stitches that were jagged and ugly. They were ghosts haunting his house, and he was their unwilling keeper. The house itself was surrendering to the same despair. The roof leaked in the corner of the main room, a steady drip, drip, drip into a tin bucket that was a constant, maddening metronome of their decay. A shutter, torn loose in a windstorm, banged against the side of the house, a sound like a fist repeatedly striking the wall. They were low on everything. The stack of firewood he had thought would last the winter was dwindling at an alarming rate. The pantry was nearly bare, a half sack of flour, a few jars of pickled beans, the last of the salted meat. Hope was the scarcest commodity of all. Eli worked to forget. He worked until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw. He split wood with a furious, desperate energy, each swing of the axe a blow against the guilt that consumed him. He should have been with them. He should have insisted they stay. He should have seen the danger. The what-ifs were a plague, a swarm of biting flies he could not swat away. He refused to ask for help, refused the casseroles and condolences offered by the few neighbors who dared approach in the first weeks. The Grangers did not take charity. They endured. It was the only thing they knew how to do. The nearby town of Redemption was no haven. It was a place of hard ground and harder memories. To the people there, Eli was not just a grieving brother. He was the son of a thief. His father, a man broken by drought and debt, had been caught with a neighbor's horses 2 decades ago. They hadn't bothered with a trial. A rope and a tall cottonwood tree had been judge and jury. The Granger name had been mud ever since. Samuel, with his good nature and pretty wife, had managed to scrub some of the stain away. But Eli, with his quiet, watchful nature and his preference for solitude, had always worn the legacy like a shroud. When he rode into town for supplies, a hush would fall over the main street. Men on the boardwalk would stop their conversations, their eyes following him with a cold, assessing curiosity. Women would gather their skirts and steer their children to the other side of the street. He was an outcast, a stray dog they watched with wary eyes, waiting for him to show the same bad blood as his father. He bought his flour and his salt in silence, paid his coin, and left without a word. The weight of their judgment a physical pressure on his back. He never looked them in the eye. He just wanted to be invisible. There was one person in town who did not stare. Not in that way. Anna Mae Caldwell. She was a widow, a quiet woman who ran the small bakery at the end of the street. Her shop was the one place in town that always smelled of warmth and life. Eli would sometimes see her through the large front window, her hands dusted with flour, her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded dough. She was as much an outsider as he was, though for different reasons. Her husband had been a brute named Jebediah Caldwell, a man whose temper was as well known as the sour whiskey he favored. He had not been shy about his displeasure with his wife, and many in town had seen the bruises she tried to hide beneath high-collared dresses. Then, one winter morning 2 years ago, Jebediah had been found dead behind their barn, his skull cracked open. The official story was that he had slipped on a patch of ice while drunk, a story most people were happy to accept. But whispers followed Anime like a shadow. Whispers that she had finally had enough. No charges were ever brought, but the suspicion clung to her, an invisible stain. She moved through the town with a quiet, reserved dignity, her eyes cast down, speaking only when necessary. She saw Eli on his rare trips to town. Their eyes had met once or twice across the dusty street. She had seen the raw grief in his face, the way he held himself as if expecting a blow. He was a wounded animal, and she knew the look, but she, like everyone else, had kept her distance. It was not her place. Then, Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost gossip, had come into the bakery for a loaf of rye and had spoken in a loud, sanctimonious voice about the state of the Granger children. "A crying shame," she had declared to the room. "Left all alone with that man. They say the house is filthy and the poor things are half-starved, with no mother to tend to them. Well, it's just not natural." Something in Anime shifted. She thought of those 3 children, their world shattered, now trapped in a cold house with a man who was drowning in his own sea of sorrow. She knew what it was to be alone, to be judged, to have your grief be the subject of town chatter. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of the children's faces, imagined but vivid, haunted her. Before dawn, her mind was made up. That morning, the snow was falling again, thicker this time, blanketing the world in white. Eli was in the barn, forking hay to his lone horse, when he heard the sound. A soft, hesitant knock on the front door of the house. He froze, listening. It came again, a little louder this time. No one ever came to his door. He walked out of the barn, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the axe he'd left by the woodpile. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. A woman stood on his porch. For a moment, he did not recognize her. She was bundled in a heavy wool shawl, a few flakes of snow clinging to her dark hair. Then he saw her face, and knew it was the baker. Anna May Caldwell. In her hands, she held something wrapped in a thick white cloth. His first instinct was to snarl, to tell her to get off his land. What did she want? Had she come to stare at the wreckage of his family? To offer the same useless, pitying words as the others? He strode towards the porch, his face set in a hard, unwelcoming mask. She did not flinch as he approached. Her eyes, a calm, steady gray, met his without fear. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sigh of the wind. She offered no smile, no preamble. She simply held out the bundle. "I brought some bread." He stared at it. The warmth from the loaf radiated through the cloth, a small circle of heat in the frozen morning. The smell of it, yeast and wheat and warmth, drifted up to him, a scent of home, of life, of everything he had lost. "We don't need it," he bit out, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. Anna May did not pull the bread back. She simply held it, waiting. Her silence was more powerful than any argument. It was not an offering of pity. He could see that now. It was something simpler, something he had forgotten existed. It was just food. He was about to tell her again, to send her away and bolt the door behind her, when it creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, her thin frame wrapped in a blanket, behind her. Thomas peeked out, and even little Martha had quieted her crying, her tear-stained face peering around her brother's legs. Their eyes were not on him, nor on the strange woman on their porch. They were fixed on the bundle in her hands, on the bread. A hunger that was more than just a need for food flickered in their gaze. It was a flicker of interest, of life, in the deadened landscape of their faces. The wall inside Eli cracked, the anger, the pride, the stubborn refusal to accept an ounce of kindness from a world that had given him nothing but pain. It all wavered in the face of that look. For them, not for him. For them. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the sound a ragged sigh of defeat. He gave a curt, barely perceptible nod toward the open door. "Get inside," he grumbled. The words directed at the children, at her, at the whole damned world. He stepped back, holding the door. As Anna Mae Caldwell walked into his house, she moved quietly to the rough-hewn table in the center of the room and placed the loaf upon it. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing a round, golden-brown loaf, steam still rising from its cracked surface. She looked at the children, a soft, sad understanding in her eyes, but said nothing. Then she turned, gave Eli a single, brief nod, and walked back out the door, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Eli stood in the doorway and watched her go. He watched her small, determined figure cross the snow-covered field, her tracks a lonely line in the otherwise unbroken white. He watched until she was just a dark speck against the gray horizon. The children were already at the table, their small hands reaching for the impossible warmth of the bread. He closed the door, shutting out the cold, but the question remained, echoing in the quiet, broken spaces of his heart. Why had she come? Why had she bothered at all? 2 days passed in a gray monotony of chores and silence. The bread was gone by the first evening, devoured with a quiet, desperate intensity that Eli had not seen in the children since before the accident. He went back to his own tasteless cooking, and the familiar pall of despair settled back over the house. He told himself the woman's visit had been a fluke, a single act of Christian charity that would not be repeated. He was almost convinced of it. Then, on the 3rd day, he saw her again. She was crossing the field, a small, dark figure against the vast, unforgiving white, this time carrying a covered metal pot that steamed faintly in the cold air. A part of him, the stubborn, prideful part, wanted to bolt the door, but he didn't. He stood on the porch and waited, his arms crossed over his chest, a fortress of a man waiting for a siege. She stopped before him, her face flushed from the cold and the walk. "I made too much stew," she said, the words simple, direct, and utterly unbelievable. She offered no other explanation. She didn't need to. He stepped aside and let her pass. The smell of the stew, rich with beef, carrots, and thyme, filled the small room. A scent so full of life it felt like a trespasser. The children, huddled by the hearth, turned their heads. Thomas's hands, usually busy whittling a stick to dust, went still. Martha's whimpering ceased. Anna ladled the thick stew into their bowls, her movements calm and efficient. She did not coo at them or try to coax them. She simply set the food down and then took a seat in the corner, as if to make herself smaller, less of a presence. The children ate. This time, even Sarah ate without the pained, mechanical slowness that had become her habit. When they were done, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire seemed to linger in the room. Anna gathered the bowls, but as she went to rinse them in the basin, little Martha, who had not willingly approached another soul in 3 months, walked up behind her and gently touched the dark fabric of her skirt. Anna froze. She turned slowly, her movements measured so as not to spook a fawn. She knelt down until she was at eye level with the small, tear-streaked girl. Martha's hair was a tangled, matted mess, something Eli's clumsy fingers had only made worse. Without a word, Anna reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small, carved wooden comb. "May I?" she whispered. Martha stared at her for a long moment, her bottom lip trembling. Then she gave a small, hesitant nod. Eli watched, his breath caught in his throat. As Anna sat on the floor and gently began to work through the tangles in his niece's hair, she was patient, her touch impossibly gentle. After 10 minutes of slow, careful work, she began to braid. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace, weaving the strands of dull brown hair into a neat, perfect plait. When she was finished, she had nothing to tie it with, so she simply tucked the end under, for the first time in months. The child's face was clear of the veil of tangled hair. She looked less feral, more like the little girl she was supposed to be. Martha reached up and touched the braid, her expression one of quiet wonder. Anna came again 2 days later, and then again 3 days after that. She never arrived empty-handed. A jar of apple butter, a small sack of cornmeal, a few thick slices of bacon wrapped in butcher paper. Her visits fell into a quiet rhythm. She would bring her offering, help with some small chore around the house, mending a tear in Thomas's shirt, scrubbing the soot from the hearth, and spend time with the children. She read to them from a worn copy of a book, her voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to fill the cracks in the broken house. Eli kept his distance. He would watch from the barn, or from the other side of the room, his silence a heavy cloak. He and Anna rarely spoke more than a handful of words to each other. "The wood is low. I'll chop some more. It looks like more snow." It usually does. Their conversations were about weather and work, the safe, impersonal facts of their existence. Yet, in the quiet spaces between the words, something else grew, a tension, a fragile awareness. He noticed the way her hands, though chapped and work-worn, were deft and gentle. He saw the deep weariness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Slowly, the routine visits turned into longer moments. After the children were asleep, she would sometimes sit by the fire for a spell before making the long walk back to town. They would sit in the 2 rickety chairs, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, the silence between them as deep and vast as the plains outside. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared quiet, a mutual acknowledgement of the sorrow that shaped their lives. In these moments, Eli felt a strange, unfamiliar easing of the knot in his chest. He was not a man who knew comfort, but this felt dangerously close to it. The town of redemption, however, did not trade in comfort. It traded in whispers. The sight of Anna Mae Caldwell's lone figure trekking to and from the Granger homestead did not go unnoticed. Tongues began to wag in the general store, over sewing circles, in the pews before the Sunday sermon. "That Caldwell woman has been out to the Granger place again, Mrs." Gable announced to anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with insinuation. "3 times this week. You have to wonder what her intentions are." "He's a man alone, with land," another chimed in. "And she's a widow with a reputation." Some women have no shame. First, she gets rid of her own husband, and now she's sinking her claws into that poor, grieving man, preying on him. That's what it is. The gossip twisted and turned, weaving a narrative that suited the town's grim imagination. Anna was a black widow, looking for shelter before the worst of the winter set in. She was trying to trap Eli, perhaps even claim his land was hers. The whispers connected their 2 isolated tragedies, braiding them together into a single, sordid tale, the Caldwell woman and that Granger devil. 2 tarnished souls finding solace in the dark. Anna heard the whispers. She felt them in the way the women in the store would go quiet when she entered, in the cold, curious stares that followed her down the street. Each glance was a fresh reminder of a past she could never outrun. Her husband, Jebediah, had been a man of impressive cruelties. He had a temper that simmered like a pot left too long on the fire, always threatening to boil over. In the beginning, she had believed his apologies, the tearful promises that it would never happen again. But it always did. The first time he'd raised a hand to her, it had been in the privacy of their own home. A shocking, brutal act that left her breathless and bruised. Over time, his cruelty had grown bolder, spilling out into the public square. He would shame her in front of the shopkeeper, calling her stupid for forgetting an item on his list. He would grab her arm with bruising force if she spoke to another man for a moment too long. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in her humiliation, in making sure the entire town knew who was in control. She had learned to make herself small, to move through the world with her eyes downcast, to become as unobtrusive as a shadow. The end had come on a bitter night in January. 2 years ago, a blizzard was raging. and Jebediah had come home from the saloon, his mood blacker than the storm. An argument had started over something trivial, a misplaced tool. His voice had risen to a roar, his face a mask of fury. He had backhanded her, sending her stumbling against the wall. "Useless woman," he had spat, his breath thick with whiskey. "I'm going to the barn. If that tool ain't on the bench when I get back, I'll take a strap to you." He had slammed the door and staggered out into the storm. Anna had remained on the floor, trembling, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She had not looked for the tool. She had simply waited. An hour passed, then 2. The storm howled, but the house was silent. A terrible, gnawing fear, mingled with an even more terrible hope, began to grow in her chest. Finally, as dawn broke and the storm quieted, she had bundled herself up and gone out to the barn. She found him lying near the woodpile, a dark stain spreading in the new-fallen snow around his head. His skull was cracked open, a grotesque wound against his pale skin. The sheriff had come, had asked his questions. She told him the truth, that they had argued, that he had gone to the barn in a drunken rage. The sheriff had looked at the patch of ice near the body, looked at her bruised face, and had written accidental death in his report. But his eyes, and the eyes of the whole town, had held a different verdict. They saw a battered wife and a dead husband, and they drew their own conclusions. They did not celebrate her freedom. They judged her for it. The judgment of the town soon took on a more official voice. Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was as starched and severe as his collars, paid a visit to her bakery one afternoon. He did not come for bread. He stood stiffly in the middle of her small, warm shop, his hands clasped behind his back, his face grim. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, his voice low and solemn, "it has come to my attention that you have been visiting the Granger homestead." Anna wiped her floured hands on her apron. "Yes, Reverend, the children have no mother." "The children have a guardian," he corrected gently. "A man who, despite his family's unfortunate history, is their kin. It is his burden to bear." He took a step closer. "Anna, I speak to you as your pastor, with concern for your soul. The town is talking. They see your situation, and they see his. They are putting 2 and 2 together. I'm just bringing them food. Reverend, mending their clothes." "You are inviting speculation," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "You carry your own shame, my dear, a heavy burden of suspicion that you may never be free of. Do not be so foolish as to drag it into the Grangers' sorrow. Their legacy is already stained. Do not add yours to it. Stay away from them. It is God's will." His words were like stones, each one a carefully aimed blow. "You have your shame." He had passed his judgment, cloaking it in the sanctimonious robes of divine will. Anna did not argue. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor, and waited for him to leave. That night, for the first time, she did not light the lamps in her bakery. She kneaded the dough for the next day's bread in the dark. The rhythmic work of her hands a small rebellion against the Reverend's decree. She would not stop. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She knew what it was to be cold and hungry and alone, and she would not abandon those children to it. The children, for their part, had begun to anticipate her visits. "Is Mrs. Caldwell coming today?" Thomas asked one morning. The first full sentence he had spoken to Eli in weeks. The question, so simple, so full of a child's hope, struck Eli with a force that surprised him. He had no answer. He had started to look for her, too, his eyes scanning the horizon in the late afternoon, a strange mix of hope and dread in his heart. He saw the toll the journey was taking on her. The weather was worsening, the wind a constant, biting force. Some days she arrived with her shawl caked in ice, her face raw from the cold. One afternoon, watching her struggle through a deep drift of snow, A decision formed in his mind. The next time she prepared to leave, he walked to the barn and returned leading his spare horse, a gentle, sway-backed mare. "Take her," he said, holding out the reins. It was not a question. Anna stared at the horse, then at him. "I can't. She's your only other horse." "She's standing in the barn doing nothing. She'll get you to and from town faster. Take her." His tone was gruff, leaving no room for argument. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. A few days later, he began building. Using scrap lumber and a few old planks, he erected a small, three-sided shelter against the leeward wall of the barn. It wasn't much, just a roof to keep the snow off and a wall to break the wind. He built a small feeding trough and a place to hang a lantern. When Anna asked what he was doing, he just grunted. "In case you get caught in a blizzard, the horse will need a place." He did not say that it was for her, but they both knew it was. It was his way of saying he wanted her there, that her presence had become a necessary part of the landscape. The blizzard he had prepared for arrived with a sudden, vicious fury. The sky turned a leaden gray, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal sheet. Eli got the children inside and secured the shutters, the world outside disappearing into a maelstrom of white. He had expected Anna to stay in town, to wait out the storm. But as dusk fell, he heard a faint cry from outside, nearly lost in the shriek of the wind. He grabbed his heaviest coat and a lantern and plunged into the blizzard. He could barely see 5 feet in front of him. He followed the sound, shouting her name into the wind. He found her 20 yards from the house, clinging to the mare's side, her clothes frozen stiff, her body racked with violent shivers. He practically carried her inside, half guiding, half dragging her through the door and into the relative warmth of the house. He sat her down in the chair by the fire, her teeth chattering so hard he was afraid she would break them. "You foolish woman," he growled, though his voice held more concern than anger. "You should have stayed in town." "The children," she chattered, unable to form a complete sentence. "I was worried." He pulled the frozen shawl from her shoulders and wrapped her in the thickest wool blanket he owned. He pushed a tin mug of hot, weak coffee into her trembling hands. The children watched from the corner, their eyes wide with fear. He sent them to their beds, and they went without a word of protest. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the relentless howl of the wind against the walls. Anna's shivering slowly subsided, leaving her pale and exhausted. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. The guard Eli kept so carefully around his heart began to crumble. This quiet, stubborn woman had walked through a blizzard for his brother's children. He sat in the chair opposite her, the space between them charged with a fragile, unspoken emotion. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the town's whispers or the shadow of her past, but a woman of immense strength and profound loneliness. He saw a soul as wounded as his own. "Anna," he said, his voice raspy. He had never used her first name before. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his in the firelight. He had to ask. He had to know. "The town, they say things about your husband." A shadow passed over her face. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "They always have." "What happened?" he asked, the question soft but direct. She was silent for so long he thought she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was a broken whisper, a thread of sound nearly lost beneath the roar of the wind. She told him everything. She spoke of the shame, the fear, the public humiliations, the private brutalities. She spoke of the final argument, of the long, terrifying night spent waiting. Her voice cracked as she described finding his body in the snow, the strange, hollow feeling of being free but forever marked. Tears tracked through the grime on her cheeks, silver in the firelight. Eli listened. He did not interrupt, did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat and absorbed the weight of her story, recognizing the familiar shape of injustice, of being judged and condemned by a world that did not know the truth. Her pain was a mirror to his own. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them once more. She looked utterly spent, fragile as a winter leaf. An impulse he did not understand and could not control moved through him. He leaned forward, his calloused, work-roughened hand reaching across the small space between them. He did not take her hand, did not presume that much. He simply let his fingers brush against hers, a fleeting, momentary contact of skin on skin. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but in the warmth of the fire, with the storm raging outside, it felt like an anchor, a silent promise that she was not, in this moment, entirely alone. The night of the blizzard left an indelible mark on the small house. It was as if the storm, in its fury, had scoured away the last of the awkwardness between them, leaving behind a quiet, settled landscape. Anna's presence was no longer an intrusion. It had become a part of the rhythm of the place, as natural and necessary as the rising of the sun. She still rode the mare back to town most evenings, but her time at the homestead grew longer, her tasks more deeply woven into the fabric of their lives. She brought flour not as a gift, but as a lesson. One afternoon, she cleared the rough-hewn table, dusted it with a fine white powder, and gave each of the children a small lump of dough. "This is how you give it life," she said softly, her hands moving with a fluid, practiced motion, pushing and folding, turning and pushing again. Eli watched from the doorway of the barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe on the chopping block faltering. He saw Martha, her face a mask of concentration, clumsily mimicking Anna's movements, a dusting of flour on her nose. He saw Sarah, her usual brittle posture softened, a small, genuine smile touching her lips as she worked the dough. Even Thomas, his silent, watchful son, was there, his hands buried in the soft white mass, his brow furrowed not with worry, but with effort. Later, the smell of baking bread filled the house, a rich, living scent that chased the lingering ghosts of grief from the corners. She had a small, wooden flute, worn smooth with time, that she carried in her apron pocket. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the wind was low, she would sit by the hearth and play. The tunes were simple, sad, and beautiful. Melodies that spoke of rolling hills and quiet streams, of love lost and of hope enduring. The music filled the house, a gentle tide that seemed to wash over the children, calming their restless spirits. They would sit near her, listening, their faces rapt. It was a sound of peace, a sound Eli had never known this house to hold. He found himself working with a renewed, almost frantic, energy. But it was no longer the desperate, punishing labor of a man trying to outrun his own guilt. This was the work of a man building, not hiding. He climbed onto the roof, his hammer echoing across the silent fields as he nailed down new shingles, finally silencing the maddening drip in the corner. He rehung the banging shutter, securing it tightly against the wind. He mended the broken fence line, his movements precise and purposeful. The pile of chopped firewood grew into a small mountain, a bulwark against the winter. With every nail he drove, with every log he split, he felt as if he were fighting back against the decay, not just of the house, but of their lives. The house was starting to feel less like a tomb and more like a shelter. It was starting to breathe again. The biggest change was in Thomas. The boy remained quiet, but he began to follow Anna as she went about her chores. A small, silent shadow. He would hand her a piece of kindling for the fire or carry the water bucket from the well, his small face unreadable. Then, one afternoon, while Eli was out checking a snare line, it happened. Anna was sitting by the fire, mending a hole in Martha's stocking, when Thomas came and sat on the floor beside her. For a long time, he said nothing, just watched the needle move in and out of the wool. Then, in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it, he spoke. "I see them sometimes, at night." Anna's hands went still. She did not look at him, but kept her eyes on her mending. giving him the space to speak without the pressure of a direct gaze. "See who, Thomas?" "The cows," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They run. The ground shakes. I see Mama. I see her fall." He drew in a ragged breath. "And Papa, he's under the wagon, and he's not moving. I call him, but he doesn't move." The raw, unvarnished horror of the child's nightmare struck Anna with a physical force. This was the source of his silence. The terrible images he had been holding inside, replaying in the dark, night after night. She set her sewing aside and turned to him, her heart aching. She did not offer empty platitudes or tell him it was just a dream. She opened her arms. He hesitated for only a second before he launched himself into her embrace, his small body rigid with unshed tears. He buried his face in her shoulder, and for the first time in months, he wept. Not the fretful crying of his sister, but the deep, soul-shattering sobs of a boy who had seen the end of his world. Anna held him tightly, rocking him gently, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. "I know," she whispered against his hair. "I know. It's all right to be scared. It's all right." She held him until the storm of his grief had passed, leaving him limp and exhausted in her arms, a fragile peace settling over him for the first time since the day of the stampede. The seasons turned, but winter held its grip on the land. A new storm blew in from the north, fiercer than any that had come before. It arrived without warning, a wall of white that descended upon the plains and swallowed the world whole. Anna had ridden out that morning, planning to return to town before noon, but the storm trapped her. For 3 days, the snow fell, piling in deep, impassable drifts. The wind howled a ceaseless, mournful song, isolating the small homestead from the rest of humanity. They were a family, sealed in a small wooden ark against a frozen sea. They shared the last of the stew and the bread they had baked together. Eli shot a rabbit that had unwisely sought shelter in his barn, and Anna cooked it with the last of their onions. They huddled around the fire, the children sleeping at their feet on a pile of blankets. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the hearth, the sound of the wind, and the quiet presence of each other. On the 3rd night, after the children had long since fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, the silence in the room felt different. It was heavier, charged with all the things that had been left unsaid between them. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on their faces. Eli looked at Anna. She was staring into the flames, a profound weariness etched into her features, but a quiet strength as well. She had brought life back into his home, had healed a wound in his nephew that he had not known how to touch. She had done it all with a quiet grace, asking for nothing in return. A feeling he could not name, a powerful current of gratitude and a deep, aching loneliness rose up in him. He reached across the small space that separated their chairs and his fingers found hers. She did not pull away. Her hand was cool, but it warmed quickly in his. He saw her throat move as she swallowed, her gaze lifting from the fire to meet his. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own solitude, his own pain. He saw the woman who had survived a brutal husband, who had faced down the judgment of an entire town, who had walked through a blizzard to bring comfort to his family. Without thought, without plan, he leaned forward. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a desperate, shared need. It was as hesitant and as quiet as their conversations had been. Her lips were soft, tasting faintly of wood smoke and sorrow. It was a kiss that spoke of long, lonely nights and unspoken grief, of a profound and startling recognition of the other's soul. It was the first moment of true, gentle contact he had known in a lifetime. He felt a tremor run through her, and she leaned into him, her other hand coming up to rest on his rough, unshaven cheek. The kiss deepened, and a fire that had long been banked within him stirred to life. A slow, spreading warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. He was drowning, and she was the first solid ground he had touched in years. Then, just as quickly, they pulled apart. The reality of their situation, of the sleeping children at their feet, of the ghosts that still haunted them both, settled back into the room. They looked at each other, their breath coming in shallow bursts. The air was thick with a new, fragile intimacy. Eli cleared his throat, the sound rough in the silence. "It's been too long," he whispered, the words a raw admission of his own desolation. "For both of us." Anna simply nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the firelight. She slowly withdrew her hand from his and stood up. "Good night, Eli," she said softly, before retreating to the small cot he had set up for her in the corner. He sat by the dying fire for another hour, the ghost of her touch still warm on his skin, his world irrevocably altered. When the storm finally broke and Anna returned to town, she found the atmosphere had grown colder than any blizzard. The whispers had festered, growing into an ugly, open sore. Silas Croft, the owner of the general store, a portly, self-important man whose clumsy advances Anna had politely but firmly rejected a year prior, had taken it upon himself to be the town's moral authority. His pride, still smarting from the rejection, had curdled into a venomous resentment. 3 days. She was out there," Croft announced to a group of men gathered around the pot-bellied stove in his store. "Trapped in a blizzard with him. You know what that means." He let the insinuation hang in the air, a greasy smile on his lips. "Wouldn't be surprised if she comes up with a belly full of Granger's brat, a fine way for a widow to trap a man with land." The rumor spread like wildfire, a vile tale that satisfied the town's darkest assumptions about them both. It painted Anna as a scheming harlot and Eli as a fool, easily seduced. A few days later, a group of 4 men rode out to the homestead. Eli saw them coming from a distance, and his hand went instinctively to the axe handle. He recognized Silas Croft in the lead, his face puffed up with self-importance. They reined in their horses in his yard, their expressions a mixture of condescension and challenge. "Granger," Croft said, not bothering to dismount, "we've come on official town business. There's been some question about your brand registration. We need to see your papers and inspect your stock." It was a lie, and they all knew it. His brand had been registered and unchanged for 20 years. It was a pretext, an excuse to invade his land, to stare and to judge. At that moment, Anna came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face clouded with worry. Croft's eyes slid over to her, a leering, unpleasant look. Well, look what we have here, keeping the house warm. Are you Mrs. Caldwell? Or is it something else you're keeping warm for him?" One of the other men snickered. The insult, crude and public, hung in the cold air. A white-hot rage, a kind Eli had not felt in years, surged through him. He did not shout, did not threaten. He moved. In 2 long strides, he was at Croft's horse. He reached up, grabbed the front of the man's thick wool coat, and with a single, powerful heave, tore him from the saddle. Croft landed in the mud with a surprised grunt. Eli stood over him, his body radiating a cold, lethal fury. "This is my land," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And that is my home. You are not welcome here. Get off my property, now!" He looked at the other 3 men, still on their horses, his eyes daring them to make a move. They exchanged nervous glances, their bluster evaporating in the face of his silent, deadly rage. They helped a mud-stained, sputtering Croft to his feet and beat a hasty retreat, not looking back. That night, the anger lingered in the house, a poison in the air. Anna was quiet, her face pale, the insult having clearly landed its intended blow. After the children were asleep, they sat by the fire, the silence between them strained for the first time since the blizzard. "They will not stop," Anna said, her voice barely a whisper. "They will keep coming." "Let them come," Eli bit out. "Why do they hate you so much?" she asked. Your family. Eli stared into the flames, the memory rising up, as vivid and as painful as if it were yesterday. My father, he began, his voice rough with the effort of speaking it aloud. He was a good man, a hard worker, but we had a few bad years, drought, then a sickness that took half our stock. We were losing everything. He paused, taking a deep breath. Our neighbor, a man named Abernathy. He was well off. One morning, 3 of his best horses were gone. A day later, the sheriff and a dozen other men showed up here. They said they'd followed the tracks. They dragged my father from this house. My mother was screaming. He fell silent, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. They found the horses in a ravine a mile from here, said he'd been planning to sell them in the next county. He swore he didn't do it. He swore on my mother's life. But Abernathy was an important man. My father was just a granger. They didn't bother with a judge. They threw a rope over the branch of a cottonwood tree down by the creek. He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow with a pain that 2 decades had not dimmed. I was 12 years old. I saw it. They made the whole town watch. They labeled us all thieves that day. It didn't matter if it was true. They had decided what we were, and that's all we've ever been to them since. Anna listened, her heart breaking for the boy he had been, for the man he had become. She reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch firm, unwavering. They did the same to me, she said, her voice filled with a fierce, quiet understanding. They decided what I was, a woman who killed her husband. It didn't matter what the truth was. They punished me for it all the same. In that moment, something shifted between them, settling into a place deeper than desire, deeper even than affection. It was a bond forged in the fires of a shared injustice. They were 2 outcasts, branded and condemned by the same cruel world. They were not just a man and a woman anymore. They were allies, and in the quiet solidarity of their shared pain, they found a strength that neither of them had ever known alone. The iron grip of winter finally loosened its hold on the land, surrendering with a slow, grudging thaw. The snow receded, first in dirty patches, then in whole swathes, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The air, for so long sharp and sterile, began to carry new smells, the scent of wet soil, of pine needles warming in the hesitant sun, of life stirring from its long sleep. The creek, choked with ice for months, began to flow again, its murmur a gentle, constant promise of renewal. On the homestead, the change was more than just seasonal. It was as if the thaw was happening inside the house as well. Small, fragile flowers, purple and yellow, began to push their way through the hard-packed earth near the porch. Sarah and Thomas discovered the song of a meadowlark and would sit for long stretches, listening to its clear, hopeful notes. The ranch felt alive, breathing in the fresh spring air. The most profound change was the sound of laughter. It started as a small, breathy giggle from Martha, a reaction to a funny face Anna had made. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that both Eli and Anna froze, staring at the child as if she had performed a miracle. Soon, it became more common, a light, bubbling sound that Eli found he had missed more than he had ever known. One bright afternoon, Anna was hanging laundered sheets on a line Eli had strung between 2 posts. The children were playing nearby in a patch of new grass. Martha, her hair in a neat braid, was chasing a pale yellow butterfly that fluttered just out of her reach. She took a clumsy, running step, tripped over her own feet, and tumbled onto the soft ground. It was not a hard fall, but it startled her. She sat up, her lower lip beginning to tremble, her eyes searching. They did not search for Eli, who was mending a harness a few yards away. They found Anna. The child's face crumpled, and a single, plaintive word escaped her lips, a word born of pure, unthinking instinct. "Mama!" The world stopped. Anna, her hand still holding a wet sheet, went utterly still. Her breath caught in her chest. The word hung in the air. Simple, powerful, and devastating. Eli. His hands frozen on the leather strap, felt it land in his gut like a physical blow. It was the sound of a hole being filled, a wound beginning to scar over. Anna slowly lowered the sheet and walked to the child. She knelt in the grass and simply held out her arms. Martha scrambled into them, burying her face in Anna's shoulder. The crisis of the fall already forgotten. The comfort she had sought and found all that mattered. Eli turned back to his harness, his eyes stinging with a sudden, fierce emotion he could not name. A week later, he rode into town for nails. The ground was soft but passable, and the air was warm on his face. He felt a lightness in his spirit that had been absent for years. He was not just fixing a homestead. He was building a life, a real one, with laughter and the smell of baking bread in it. He tied his horse outside the general store and had just stepped onto the boardwalk when a voice, thick with whiskey, called his name. "Granger!" He turned. Leaning against the wall of the saloon was Harker, the ex-sheriff. His face flushed, his eyes bloodshot. A few other loafers were with him, watching with sullen interest. "Heard you're playing house out there with the Caldwell woman," Harker sneered, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Letting a murdering witch raise your brother's kids. You got no shame?" The pleasant warmth of the day vanished, replaced by an icy calm that settled over Eli. He had heard the whispers, seen the looks, but this was different. This was a public accusation, a brand being pressed into his skin for all to see. "You're drunk, Harker," Eli said, his voice low and flat. "Go sleep it off." He turned to walk away, but Harker pushed himself off the wall and blocked his path. "I ain't drunk enough to forget what she is. Jebediah was my friend. She cracked his skull open and played the grieving widow. And now she's got her hooks in you. She'll do the same to you, Granger, once she has your land." Eli's world narrowed to the man's sneering, bloated face. He saw not just Harker, but every man who had ever judged him, every whisper that had ever followed him, every eye that had ever looked at him and seen only his father's son. He saw the man who was trying to poison the one good thing that had ever walked into his life. His fist shot out, a hard, compact knot of bone and rage. It connected with Harker's jaw with a sickening crack. The ex-sheriff stumbled backward, his eyes wide with surprise, before collapsing in a heap in the street. The other men, shocked into action, surged forward, before it could become a full-blown brawl. The current sheriff, a young, sober man named Davis, came running out of his office. "That's enough," he shouted, grabbing Eli's arm. "Harker, get up. Eli, you know better than to start a fight in the middle of the street." "He wasn't starting it," a voice said. It was the blacksmith, a large, quiet man who had witnessed the exchange. Harker was running his mouth. Eli just finished the conversation. Sheriff Davis looked from Harker, who was groaning and holding his jaw, to Eli's cold, furious face. He let out a weary sigh. "Go on home. Eli, just go home. I don't want to see you in town for a while." Eli didn't buy his nails. He rode home, the rage inside him a cold, hard stone. When Anna saw his face as he rode into the yard, she knew immediately that something was wrong. He told her what had happened, his words clipped and harsh. He expected her to be angry or frightened. Instead, he saw the light in her eyes simply go out. The strength that had held her together for 2 years, the quiet dignity that had been her only shield, finally dissolved. She sank onto the porch step and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the first time he had ever seen her cry for herself. "I can't," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired. Eli, I'm tired of being a ghost. I'm tired of being feared. I thought maybe here, it could be different." He sat down beside her, his large frame feeling clumsy and useless. He wanted to fix this, to fight it, but he had just proved that his fists only made things worse. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. a hesitant, gentle touch. "Anna," he said, his voice rough. He waited until she looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a despair that mirrored his own. An idea, wild and desperate and yet utterly right, took root in his mind. "Marry me," he said. She stared at him, her crying stopping abruptly. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, the words feeling more certain the second time. "If you're my wife, you'll have my name. You'll belong here. They won't be able to look at you like you're just a stray. You'll be the mother of these children in the eyes of the law. They'll have to leave you alone." She pulled away from him, shaking her head, a fresh wave of pain in her eyes. "No, I won't be a burden to you. I won't have you marry me out of pity. Eli, I couldn't bear that." He took her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gently wiping away her tears, forcing her to look at him. "This ain't pity, Anna," he said, his voice raw with an intensity that surprised them both. "Do you think I've done all this out of pity? I'm fixing this house for you. I'm chopping this wood for you. This is me not wanting to face another morning without you in this house. Pity has nothing to do with it." His eyes, clear and dark and fiercely sincere, held hers. He was offering her not just a name, not just protection, but himself, the truth of it, the shocking, terrifying, beautiful truth of it, left her breathless. But the years of hurt had built thick walls. Before she could answer, the decision was taken out of their hands. Silas Croft, smarting from his humiliation at the ranch and emboldened by Eli's public brawl, had found a new weapon. A few days after the fight, Sheriff Davis rode out to the homestead, his face grim. "Eli, I've got bad news," he said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Croft and some others have called a town meeting. They're putting it to a vote. They're going to petition the circuit judge to have the children removed from your custody." The ground seemed to fall away beneath Eli's feet. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "They're saying you're an unfit guardian," Davis said, refusing to meet his eyes. "They're citing your family history, the fight in town, and they're saying you're keeping company with a woman of ill repute, and that it's an improper environment for children." The rage was gone, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. This was his greatest fear, the one he had not even dared to name to himself. They were using Anna to take his brother's children from him. That night, after the children were asleep, a terrible silence filled the house. Eli stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone, but Anna could see the terror in his eyes. "They can't do it," she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. "They can't just take them away." He finally looked at her, his composure breaking, his face a landscape of raw agony. "They can," he said, his voice hoarse. "They can do anything they want. They're the town. I'm just a Granger." He reached for her hand, his grip crushing. "Anna, if they take those children, if I lose them too, I won't survive it." The stark, utter truth of his words hung between them. He was not just their guardian. They were his anchor, the only thing that had kept him from being completely consumed by his grief and guilt. Seeing his desperation, a fire was lit in Anna, a fierce, protective anger that burned away her own fear and exhaustion. She would not let this happen. She would not let the cruel, baseless judgments of these people destroy this fragile family. The next morning, she put on her best dress, a simple gray wool, and walked the entire way to town. She did not go to the general store or the sheriff's office. She walked directly to the home of Reverend Miller. He received her in his dark, book-lined study, his face a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said stiffly, "to what do I owe this visit?" Anna did not sit. She stood before his desk, her hands clasped, her posture straight, her gaze direct. "Reverend, I have come to talk to you about the Granger children." "That is a matter for the town to decide," he said coolly. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. resonating with a moral authority he had never heard from her before. "It is a matter of truth. Months ago, you came to my bakery. You told me not to drag my shame into their sorrow. You told me it was God's will that I stay away." The Reverend had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I spoke out of concern for—" "You spoke out of fear of gossip," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "But what I brought to that house was not shame. Reverend, I brought them bread when they were hungry. I mended their clothes. I braided a little girl's hair. I held a little boy while he cried out the nightmares he had been holding in for months. I brought them a mother's touch, because they had none. Tell me, Reverend, which part of that was against God's will?" He was stunned into silence. She had not come to him as a supplicant, but as an equal, confronting his judgment with the simple, irrefutable truth of her actions. "The town wants to take those children from the only family they have left," she continued, her voice ringing with passion. "They want to tear them away from a man who is trying, in his own broken way, to hold his world together for them. They will be sent away, scattered to strangers. Is that the Christian thing to do? Reverend Miller, is that justice, or is it just old, hateful prejudice, dressed up in piety?" She let the questions hang in the silent room. She had laid the truth at his feet. It was up to him to either step over it or to pick it up. The hearing was held 2 days later in the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with hostility and morbid curiosity. Croft and Harker sat in the front row, their faces triumphant. Eli stood at the front of the room, stiff and uncomfortable in his Sunday best. Anna stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Sarah, Thomas, and Martha stood with them, the 2 girls clinging to Anna's skirt, Thomas holding tightly to her hand. They were a portrait of a family, a silent testament against the town's accusations. The circuit judge, a weary, gray-haired man named Patterson, listened patiently. Silas Croft spoke first, his voice booming with self-righteousness, detailing Eli's legacy, the brawl with Harker, and painting Anna as a dangerous, immoral influence. Several other townspeople spoke, echoing his sentiments. It was a bleak, ugly procession of hearsay and innuendo. Eli was asked to speak, but he could only manage a few clipped, defensive sentences. He was not a man of words, and in this setting, his silence was mistaken for guilt. The judge's expression was grim. Then, Reverend Miller stood up. A hush fell over the room. Everyone expected him to deliver the final, damning blow. He walked to the front, his Bible in his hand. "I have known the Granger family my whole life," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And I have known the weight of the tragedy that has followed their name. I will not stand here and pretend there is not a history of sorrow, but I have also been a witness these past few months." He turned and looked directly at Anna. "I have witnessed a woman, herself, no stranger to sorrow and judgment, perform an act of profound and selfless Christian charity. I have seen her bring warmth and care to a house that was cold with grief. I have seen, with my own eyes, these children begin to heal under her care." He then looked at Eli. "And I have seen a man, burdened by a grief that would have broken many, stand up and take responsibility for his kin. He is a quiet man, not a polished one, but I believe his heart is true. To remove these children from his care, from the only home they have ever known, would be an act not of justice, but of cruelty." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Croft's face was a study in apoplectic rage. Judge Patterson listened to it all, his eyes moving from the Reverend to Eli and Anna, and finally to the children, huddled together, their small faces filled with fear. He sighed, a long, heavy sound. "This is a difficult situation," he said finally. "Mr. Granger, your past and your recent actions in town give me pause. However, the testimony of the Reverend carries great weight, and the clear affection these children have for both you and Mrs. Caldwell is undeniable." He banged his gavel once. "I am granting Eli Granger temporary custody of the children," he announced. The relief that washed over Eli was so profound his knees almost buckled. But the judge was not finished. He fixed Eli with a hard, unwavering stare. "But this custody is provisional. It is under the strict supervision of this court and this town. Your behavior and the environment of your home will be scrutinized. One mistake, one complaint that I find credible, and I will remove them without a second thought." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone that carried across the silent room. "You are being watched, Mr. Granger. Make no mistake about it." The judge's warning echoed in the silence of their ride home, a promise and a threat that settled over the homestead like a low-hanging cloud. They had won, but it was a victory on borrowed time. The feeling of being watched, of having their every action scrutinized by hostile eyes, permeated everything. Their small patch of land was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, and they were the unwilling actors in a play for their family's survival. This new reality sparked not despair, but a quiet, fierce determination. They began to work, side by side, with a shared purpose that needed no words. The coming inspection, though no date was set, became the focus of their days. They were not just repairing a ranch. They were building a fortress of respectability, a defense against the town's judgment. Eli, his jaw set in a permanent line of resolve, worked from sunup to sundown. He repaired the last of the sagging corral fences, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear spring air. He whitewashed the front porch, the bright, clean color a stark defiance against the years of neglect and dark reputation. He cleared the field of stones, his muscles straining, turning the hard, fallow ground into neat, promising rows. Anna worked alongside him, her energy a match for his own. She started a small garden near the house, her hands turning the dark soil, planting rows of seeds for beans, carrots, and squash. She taught Sarah how to do it, her patient voice explaining how much water each seed needed, how to protect the tender shoots from late frosts. Inside, she scrubbed the house until the wooden floors shone. She washed and mended every piece of clothing they owned, patching knees and darning socks with meticulous care, with a few pennies saved from her bakery. She bought a bolt of simple calico fabric in town and sewed new dresses for the girls, the cheerful floral pattern a splash of defiant color in their somber world. The children, sensing the shift in the air, became part of the effort. Thomas, his silence now more companionable than vacant, took it upon himself to keep the wood box constantly filled, his small arms wrapped around logs nearly as big as he was. Sarah helped Anna in the garden and learned to knead bread, her small hands gaining confidence with each push and fold. Even little Martha had a job, tasked with collecting eggs from the henhouse, which she did with a solemn, self-important air, carrying each egg as if it were a precious jewel. They were a unit, a small, tightly knit clan working against a hostile world. But the world would not let them forget its hostility. One morning, as Anna walked to the barn to milk their lone cow, she saw it. Nailed to the rough wood of the door with a crudely forged nail was a piece of scorched paper. The words, written in jagged, hateful letters formed from charcoal, were a vicious slash against the quiet hope of the morning. "Murderers don't make mothers." The air rushed from Anna's lungs. The words were aimed at her heart, a poisoned arrow striking her deepest, most fragile insecurities. She felt the blood drain from her face, the familiar, cold shame washing over her. For a moment, she was back in that courtroom, back in the general store, hearing the whispers, feeling the weight of their condemnation. She reached out a trembling hand to pull the note from the door, but Eli was suddenly there beside her. He had seen her stop, had seen the look on her face from across the yard. He looked at the note, and his face, which had softened in recent weeks, hardened into a mask of granite. He did not speak. His eyes burned with a cold, blue fire. He wrenched the nail from the wood with his bare fingers, pulled the hateful piece of paper free, and crumpled it in his fist.
Eli,
Anna began, her voice a broken whisper. He turned and walked to the fire pit where they burned their rubbish. He struck a match and held it to the crumpled paper. He watched it catch, curl, and turn to black, weightless ash that drifted away on the morning breeze. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the dissipating smoke as if he could will the hatred that had formed it to vanish as well. When he finally turned back to her, his expression was bleak. "Go inside, Anna," he said, his voice rough. "I'll get the milk." That night, the ugly words of the note hung in the air between them, a ghost at their silent dinner table. Anna tried to be strong, to act as if it had not affected her, but Eli could see the new fragility in her eyes, the way her smile for the children no longer quite reached them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the town would never stop. They would chip away at her, and at him, until they broke them. After the children were asleep, a soft spring rain began to fall, drumming a gentle rhythm on the newly repaired roof. Anna stood by the window, staring out into the dark, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her splintering courage together. "Don't let them win, Anna," Eli said from behind her, his voice low. She turned, her face a pale oval in the dim lamplight. "How do we fight them, Eli? They hate us. They hate what we are. How can we ever be safe here?" He had no answer for that. He only knew one thing. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before her. He reached out, not with the hesitant touch of before, but with a new, firm certainty, and pulled her into his arms. She came without resistance, her body molding against his as if she had always belonged there. She buried her face in his chest, and he could feel the tremors running through her. "They won't win," he whispered into her hair, the words a vow, a prayer. "I won't let them." He tilted her face up to his and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of defiance, of 2 lonely souls clinging to each other in a storm. It was a dam breaking, releasing a flood of pent-up sorrow and longing that had been building for months. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his own narrow bed in the small room off the main living space. He laid her down gently, the soft light from the main room tracing the lines of her face. There were tears in her eyes, and he knew there were tears in his own. This was not about passion in its simplest form. It was about something far more profound. It was about finding a sanctuary in a world that offered none. Their coming together was quiet, slow, and achingly tender. It was a discovery, a mapping of lonely landscapes. His large, calloused hands, so used to the roughness of wood and leather, were impossibly gentle against her skin. Her touch was a revelation, a balm on wounds he had carried for so long he had forgotten they were there. It was a moment of absolute healing, a silent, desperate communication that went deeper than words, in the dark, with the rain drumming on the roof. They were not the town's pariahs. They were just a man and a woman, finding solace, finding home in each other's arms, and when it was over, they lay tangled together, their silent tears mingling on the pillow, tears not of sorrow, but of a deep, painful, and overwhelming release. The next day dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the rain. A fragile peace had settled in the house, an intimacy that was new and unspoken, but that peace was shattered before noon.
"Thomas is gone."
Sarah's voice was sharp with panic.
"I can't find him anywhere."
Eli and Anna exchanged a look of pure, cold dread. They searched the house, the barn, the fields. They called his name until their voices were raw. There was no sign of him. A raw, animal fear, the kind Eli had not felt since the day of the stampede, gripped him. He saddled his horse, his movements jerky with panic.
"I'll check the creek. Anna, you search the woods to the east."
For 2 frantic hours, they searched. Eli rode the length of the creek, his heart pounding with every shadow, every rustle in the brush. Finally, deep in a grove of cottonwood trees, Anna found him. He was huddled at the base of a large tree, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. He was not crying. He was unnervingly still. She knelt beside him, her heart aching. "Thomas, what is it? What's wrong?" He wouldn't look at her. He just shook his head, his small body rigid. "You scared us," she said gently, stroking his hair. "We were so worried." Finally, he looked up, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his eyes filled with a misery that was old beyond his years. "They said he's the devil's son," he whispered, his voice cracking. "At church, the other boys, they said my real papa stole and my new papa is a Granger, and that's the same as the devil, and they said you're a witch." He choked on a sob. "They said we're all going to hang, just like my grandpa did." The words, so cruel, so childishly absolute, struck Anna with the force of a physical blow. The town's poison had seeped into its children, and now they were using it to crucify this small, grieving boy. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight, rocking him as she had done once before. When Eli found them, the story came tumbling out again. The cold, hard fury returned to his face, more intense than ever before. He helped Anna get Thomas back to the house, his movements stiff with rage. He saw Anna settle the boy by the fire, her voice a low, soothing murmur, her touch a gentle balm. He saw the love and safety she offered, the very thing the note on the barn had denied her the right to give, and something inside him broke. He turned without a word and strode out of the house. He threw the saddle back on his horse and swung himself up. He was not thinking, only feeling a white-hot, blinding rage that demanded an outlet. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and galloped toward town, toward the source of the poison. He was going to find Reverend Miller. He was going to tear the man's pious world apart. He thundered into redemption, his horse scattering chickens and drawing shocked stares, and reined in hard in front of the preacher's house. He swung down from the saddle and stormed up the steps, his hand raised to hammer on the door. But as his fist was about to fall, he stopped. He saw his own reflection in the window glass, a wild-eyed, furious man, no different from the mob that had taken his father. Violence was all he had ever known. It was the Granger way. Fight back, with fists, with rage, with silence. But it had solved nothing. It had only dug their hole deeper. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the rage down, banking the fire. When Reverend Miller opened the door, his face a mixture of fear and surprise, he did not find a wild man. He found a broken father. "My boy ran away today," Eli said, his voice scraped raw with pain. "My nephew, he ran because the children at your church called him the son of a devil, because they told him he would hang, like his grandfather." The Reverend's face paled. I had not heard." "You've heard the whispers your whole life." Eli cut him off, his voice low but powerful. "You stood up in that hearing and you spoke of charity. But charity isn't one speech. Reverend, it's a daily truth. And the truth is, your town is poisoning those children. My father, he never stole those horses. The man who accused him, Abernathy, he found them a year later, sold to a farmer 2 counties over by a drifter who'd worked for him. Abernathy was too proud to admit he'd been wrong, that he'd gotten an innocent man killed. So the truth was buried, and we've been buried with it ever since." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into the preacher's. "I'm not asking you to fight my fights. I'm not asking you to make them like me. I'm asking you to speak the truth from your pulpit. Not about me, about them, about the sin of judging a man by his name, and the sin of letting a lie fester for 20 years until it starts to poison children." He turned and walked away, leaving the Reverend standing speechless in his doorway. The next Sunday, Reverend Miller's sermon was on the 9th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." He did not mention the Grangers by name, but he spoke with a fiery passion about the corrosive power of gossip, of old grudges, of condemning a man, or his children, for sins they did not commit. He spoke of redemption, not as a gift for the righteous, but as a duty for a community that had lost its way. Something began to shift. It was not a flood, but a slow, quiet turning of the tide. A woman at the general store, who had once pulled her child away from Anna, met her eyes and gave a small, hesitant nod. A farmer left a sack of potatoes on the Granger's porch one evening, disappearing before he could be thanked. Then came a formal invitation, delivered by the Reverend's wife, for the children to attend the annual church picnic. It was a peace offering. Eli knew what he had to do. The next time he went to town, he did not go to the general store or the saloon. He went to the small shop of the town's silversmith. He did not have much money, but he had enough. He waited until evening, until the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the fields. He found Anna by the new garden, her hands in the rich, dark earth. "Anna," he said. She stood and turned. Brushing the dirt from her hands, he held out his hand, palm up. Lying in the center of his calloused palm was a ring. It was not a fancy, store-bought thing. It was a simple, slender band of silver. On the inside, almost too small to see, the smith had carved her name. Her breath caught in her throat. "I asked you once out of fear," Eli said, his voice quiet and steady. "Now I'm asking for me. I want you to be my wife, Anna. Not for the town, not for the judge, for me, for us." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or of fear. She looked from the ring to his face, at his steady, hopeful eyes, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her lips. "Yes, Eli," she whispered. "Yes." He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He did not kiss her lips. Instead, he lifted her hand, the hand that was still smudged with the dirt of the garden she had planted, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound respect, of reverence. He was kissing the hand that had braided his niece's hair, the hand that had comforted his nephew, the hand that had reached for his in the dark. He was kissing the hand that had offered him bread, and in doing so, had offered him back his life. The summer that followed was a season of quiet miracles. The ranch, once a skeleton picked clean by grief and neglect, put on flesh. The fields Eli had painstakingly cleared and planted yielded a modest but steady crop of corn and beans. Anna's garden flourished, a riot of green leaves and bright blossoms that promised a well-stocked pantry for the coming winter. The house, once a drafty shell that echoed with sorrow, was now filled with the scent of baking bread, the murmur of children's voices, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of a life being rebuilt. Board by board, day by day, laughter, once a foreign sound, became the house's native tongue. Eli would watch from the barn as Anna taught the children a clapping game, their small hands moving in and out, their faces alight with pure, uncomplicated joy. He saw Thomas, his solemn, watchful boy, actually chase Sarah across the field, their shrieks of delight carrying on the warm breeze. He saw Martha, his little Martha, sitting on the porch steps, chattering away to a corn-husk doll Anna had made for her, a world of happy nonsense spilling from her lips. They were no longer the haunted, half-feral creatures he had inherited. They were children again, their smiles as bright and as welcome as the summer sun. Eli himself had changed. The hard, bitter shell he had carried for 2 decades had been cracked open, and the man underneath was someone he barely recognized. A quiet contentment had settled deep in his bones. He still worked from dawn until dusk, but the labor was no longer a punishment. It was an act of creation, of love. He found himself smiling at the children's antics, his lips still clumsy with the unfamiliar expression. Sometimes, in the evening, when he and Anna sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast, velvet sky, he would reach for her hand, their fingers lacing together in a comfortable, practiced silence that spoke more than words ever could. The silver ring on her finger was a constant, tangible reminder that he was no longer alone. In late August, a stranger rode into Redemption. He was not a cowboy or a farmer. He wore a city suit, slightly rumpled from travel, and carried a leather satchel. He introduced himself as Mr. Alistair Finch, a lawyer from a bigger town to the east. His arrival caused little stir at first. Traveling lawyers were not unheard of. But his business was not with the living. It was with the dead. He had been hired by a wealthy land speculator to sort out the tangled estate of Jebediah Caldwell. Jebediah, it turned out, had owned a significant parcel of land bordering the railroad's intended expansion route, a fact he had kept to himself, hoping to extort a fortune from the company. His death had left the title unclear, and the speculator, a man with no patience for loose ends, had sent Finch to resolve it. Finch was a meticulous man. He began digging through old records, interviewing townspeople, and re-examining the circumstances of Jebediah's death. He was not interested in the town's gossip or its settled conclusions. He was interested only in facts. He learned quickly that Jebediah was a man who made enemies as easily as he breathed. He had cheated men in card games, reneged on debts, and threatened neighbors in disputes over water rights. The key came from a disgruntled stable hand whom Jebediah had fired without pay a week before his death. The man, long since moved on, was tracked down by an agent of the lawyer. He told Finch a story he had been too afraid to tell the old sheriff. On the night of the blizzard, the night Jebediah died, he had seen two men, ranchers from the next county with whom Jebediah was in a bitter land dispute, waiting in the shadows near the Caldwell barn. They were hard men with violent reputations. The stable hand had kept his mouth shut, afraid of what they might do to him. He had convinced himself that Jebediah had simply slipped on the ice, as the official story went, and that what he had seen was a coincidence. But it was enough. Finch, armed with this new testimony, dug deeper. He discovered that the two ranchers had mysteriously come into a large sum of money shortly after Jebediah's death and had used it to buy the very parcel of land the railroad now wanted. The pieces clicked into place. It was not a drunken accident. It was not a wife's desperate act of self-preservation. It was a cold-blooded murder over a land deal. The news swept through Redemption like a flash flood, washing away 2 years of ingrained suspicion in a single, stunning afternoon. The whispers that had followed Anna, the stain on her name, the shame she had been forced to carry, were erased. She was not a murderess. She was a victim, a widow in the truest sense. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now approached her with downcast eyes and mumbled apologies. Silas Croft suddenly found his store empty, the townsfolk taking their business to a competitor, their silent judgment a more potent punishment than any Eli could have delivered with his fists. When Sheriff Davis rode out to the homestead to deliver the official news, Anna listened with a quiet, solemn dignity. She did not cry with relief or rage at the injustice she had suffered. She simply nodded, a profound, weary peace settling on her features. The burden she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. She was free. The wedding was not planned for weeks or months later. It happened the following Sunday. There was no need to wait. Their life together had already begun. They were not married in the church, before the eyes of the town that had misjudged them both for so long. They chose the creek, the place where the tall cottonwood tree stood, its branches a stark silhouette against the sky. It was a place of ghosts, a site of old pain and injustice for Eli's family. But on this day, it would be reclaimed. It would become a place of new beginnings. Reverend Miller, his face humbled and sincere, performed the ceremony. The only guests were the children. Sarah and Martha had spent the morning gathering wildflowers, black-eyed Susans, purple asters, and delicate white Queen Anne's lace, and they clutched the makeshift bouquets in their small hands. Thomas stood beside Eli, his small frame straight and proud, a silent, solemn witness. Anna wore her simple gray dress, the one she had worn to confront the preacher, but today it seemed transformed. elegant in its simplicity. Eli wore his clean work clothes. They stood on the grassy bank, the gentle murmur of the creek a backdrop to the Reverend's words. They did not exchange fancy rings, only the simple silver band Anna already wore, when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife. Eli did not kiss her with the desperate passion of their first true embrace, but with a deep, tender reverence. He was not just kissing his bride. He was kissing the woman who had saved him. The children cheered, a small, happy sound that the wind carried through the leaves of the old cottonwood tree, chasing the last of the ghosts away. That night, after the children were asleep, a profound peace settled over the house. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on the room. Eli sat in his chair, watching Anna as she moved about, tidying the last of the day away. She came and sat on the floor at his feet, leaning her head against his knee. He gently stroked her hair, the simple, domestic act filling him with a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "You know," she whispered, her voice soft in the quiet room, "when I first came here, this house felt so cold. It was like the sorrow was in the very walls." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You gave them back to life. Eli, Sarah, Thomas, Martha. You brought them back from that terrible, silent place, and you gave me back my life, too." Eli's hand stilled in her hair. He looked around the small, warm room, at the neatly stacked firewood, the clean swept floor, the mended curtains on the windows. He thought of the silence, the crushing, absolute loneliness that had been his only companion for so long. He remembered the first time he had seen her, a small, determined figure walking across a field of snow, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "You walked in here carrying bread, Anna," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you brought was more than warmth." As if on cue, a sudden flurry of white appeared at the window. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, large, soft flakes drifting down from the dark sky. The story had come full circle. It was winter again on the Granger homestead. The snow was falling, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. But this time, the house was not cold. The fire burned bright. The pantry was full, and the rooms were filled with the quiet, steady breathing of sleeping children. The house was no longer a tomb of sorrow, but a bastion of love, a small, warm light against the vast, cold darkness. And the town of redemption began, ever so slowly, to live up to its name, the story of Eli and Anna, of the quiet baker and the haunted cowboy, became a part of the town's fabric. It was not a grand, heroic tale, but a whispered legend, a story told on cold winter nights around hearths that seemed a little warmer for the telling. It was a story of how two broken souls, branded by the world's cruelty, had found in each other the strength to heal, to forgive, and to build a life. It became a quiet reminder, passed from one lonely soul to the next, that even in the harshest of winters, a single, simple act of kindness, like offering a loaf of warm bread, could be enough to bring the spring. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.